Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with loaded butternut squash cordon bleu. That's right, there are so many amazing things people do with butternut squash. They roast it, they make soup, well, actually, that's pretty much it. Which is why I'm so excited to show you this. And by the way, I'm burying the lead here. This video is actually serving as a test for a new studio I'm going to be filming in. So if everything looks different, it is. And I was not working with my full setup. But despite that, this came out incredibly well. And to get started, let's talk about how to choose the right butternut squash for this recipe. And that would be one where the bottom and the top part or neck are about the same size. Okay, the bottom's always going to be a little more bulbous, but if you can, try to find one like this where that is not so pronounced. And then once we have our squash, the next thing we want to do is cut it in half lengthwise without losing a finger. And for that, we will start our cut going through the top, ideally cutting through that really hard stem right through the center. And at no point during this operation should your other hand come anywhere near that blade. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll use that as a guide to cut all the way to the back of the squash. Although definitely not in one big grand cut. Okay, we want to go slow and just do a little bit at a time, which I do with a combination of a rocking motion on the knife, as well as for the thicker parts giving it a little pound with the other hand on top. But again, at no point is our guide hand anywhere close to being able to go under the blade. And eventually, especially if your first cut was nicely centered, you should be able to split this in two very uniformly. And that's it, we now have two halves, and at least 10 fingers. And then once we have that split, we'll go ahead and take a spoon and scrape out the seeds. And one of the main reasons I want you to buy a squash that's not overly curvaceous is because you're going to have less seeds and more squash. Okay, so please remember that old rhyme. If the butternut squash has a large ass, you're going to want to take a pass. But anyway, we'll go ahead and scrape out those seeds as shown. And then so these sit nice and flat, I think we should slice off about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom. Right, not too much. Just a little bit so they lay nice and flat. And that is going to be it for our prep. We'll go ahead and transfer those onto a foil lined baking sheet. At which point we can transfer that into the center of a 375-degree oven for about 1.5 hours or so, depending on the size, or until they are beautifully tender but not falling apart. And of course, we're going to test that with the tip of a knife. And you can see here some old scars from previous testing. And then as soon as those are cool enough to handle, what we'll do is scoop that cooked squash into a bowl. But very important, we do want to leave about 1/2 inch attached to the skin. So I'll actually use the boundary of the cavity at the bottom as a guide, and then we'll go around scooping, getting most of it. But like I said, we do want to leave some attached so this doesn't fall apart, since of course we're going to use these as shells to stuff everything back into. And if we end up scooping all the way down to the skin, these might sort of collapse when we cook them, and they just won't look as nice. And then to our scoop squash, we will add some salt, as well as some freshly ground black pepper, plus a nice big spoon of Dijon mustard, which is absolutely critical here. Okay, we really do need that to balance the sweetness and the richness. And that's it, we're going to finish this step up with 1 beaten egg, at which point we'll take a nice big spoon and give this a mix, but also a mash, alright, if you want. Okay, if you want to leave this nice and chunky, that's your business. I mean, you guys are after all the lords of your loaded gourds. But personally, I do like to smash mine fairly smooth. And then what we'll do once that's been all stirred and smashed together is toss in some sliced green onions. Followed by, because we're calling this cordon bleu, some diced smoked ham. And a lot of it. As well as some Gruyere cheese, which is the classic cheese used in cordon bleu. But I think a nice sharp white cheddar would also work out beautifully here. And that's it, we'll simply give this a mix until everything is combined. And as you might have noticed, I actually diced the cheese instead of grating it, since I think texturally those bigger pieces are going to work better in this. Okay, I think if the cheese is grated, it sometimes emulsifies right into the squash, instead of having hundreds of little pockets of cheese here and there. And also, I forgot to bring the cheese grater to the chute. And that's it, as soon as that's mixed, we'll go ahead and fill our shells as evenly as possible, which is a classic example of a super obvious instruction that nobody ever needs, but always gets. Okay, raise your hand if you were going to put a lot more in one than the other. See, I didn't need to tell you that. But what I do need to tell you is that once those halves are stuffed, we'll go ahead and top this with a little more cheese. And I'm actually going to use a potato peeler here to make nice long thin slices, which I think is going to look a little nicer than if we used a grater, which of course coincidentally I don't have. And just to bother some people, I did one haphazardly, and then did the second one in a much more orderly fashion. Probably to prove that once they come out of the oven, they're going to look the same. And that's it. Once those have been cheesed, Rando and Crosshatch were ready to transfer into the center of a 475-degree oven for about 15 minutes or so, or until they're beautifully browned and look like there's a green onion on the table. Man, that's annoying. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, or until they look like this. And I know it is not normal to get so excited over a squash recipe, but I really was, since this looked and smelled so amazing. And then I went ahead and transferred those onto a cutting board for service, partly because I didn't have a big platter with me, but also because we're going to slice these into sections when we serve them anyway. And that's it. I went ahead and finished up with some sliced green onions. And then I relocated to our new quartz countertop, since I thought it would look nicer for the pictures. Since, as I mentioned, this was a test for getting a feel for the new studio. And we'll do a full reveal at the appropriate time, but here's a little sneak peek at the range island. Okay, that's enough. But anyway, I grabbed a knife and sliced in, and loved everything I was feeling and seeing. And I couldn't wait to grab a fork and dig in. And that, my friends, was some incredibly hammy, cheesy, butternut squashy goodness. Okay, extremely flavorful as well as fairly rich and decadent, but not overly so. And a lot of that comes from the Gruyere cheese, which is very buttery and nutty, and that's why it works so well with the squash. And of course, smoked ham is never not great with these ingredients, so I don't really feel like I even need to mention that. And I'm not doing a very good job of showing it, but the still attached squash does come off really easily from the skin. Okay, I was just worried about hitting the tripod. It's not really that hard. So yes, this was quite lovely eaten right off the cutting board. But I did go ahead and plate up another portion next to a salad, which I think for something like this is a very necessary pairing. Right, not only do we get a temperature and texture contrast, but an acidic dressing will help cut through the richness we spoke about earlier. And I know, you're probably thinking that all sounds great, but please, for the love of God, can you eat that piece of diced ham off the top? It's been sitting up there way too long. Don't worry, I got you. And while I'm definitely presenting this as a main course, I think this could also work very nicely as a holiday side dish. Although I would probably switch out the ham for some caramelized mushrooms, which I'm thinking would be very, very nice. But whether you make this meatless or not, or you serve it as an entree or a side, either way, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Fried stuffed squash blossoms. This was one of the most delicious things I've eaten in a long time, and I really hope you have access to squash blossoms wherever you happen to live. Of course, if you have a garden and you planted zucchini, you will have an abundance of squash blossoms. So there they are, gorgeous, beautiful squash blossoms. I believe these are from zucchini, but I can't confirm that. All right, so step one here, we're going to blanch the squash blossoms in some boiling salted water. So bring some water to a boil on the stove. You're also going to want to have a bowl of very cold water to throw the squash blossoms in as soon as they come out of the boiling water. So when the water is boiling, throw your squash blossoms in, and we're only going to do this for about 30 seconds or so, maybe 45. All right, so this is kind of almost real time, although I did a little bit of editing. So basically, we're just wilting them very slightly so that we're able to stuff them. So as soon as they look like that, which again is only going to be about a half a minute, plunge those into your ice water or very, very cold water. And when they're completely chilled, remove to paper towels to drain. So while our squash blossoms are draining, we're going to go ahead and make our stuffing, which is basically a goat cheese filling. So I have room temperature goat cheese, nice and soft. I'm going to add an egg yolk and then a little bit of grated sharper style cheese. Now I'm using a sheep's milk cheese called Ardii Gazna, I believe it's how it's pronounced. But you could use anything like a Gruyere or a cheddar or even a Manchego. All right, I'm also going to give it a little bit of black pepper and some cayenne. And I'm going to stir that until completely smooth, and that is our filling. Transfer that into a heavy-duty plastic bag. We're going to do the old trick where you snip off the end there and make like a little piping bag. All right, you've seen us do that before, right? Okay, so once the filling's done and in the bag, we are going to stuff our now drained squash blossoms. So at the bottom, at the base here, we're going to have a little bit of an opening, a little bit of a cavity you can kind of see down in there. So that's where most of the stuffing's going to go. So you want to put your piping bag or your plastic bag with the cutoff tip all the way to the bottom, pipe in about a tablespoon, and then use the petals, which are now very soft and easy to work with, we're going to drape the petals over any exposed cheese filling. And it doesn't look like it when you first start, but there's going to be enough to cover beautifully. See that? And just fold any excess back. All right, one more time. Stick your piping bag, or in our case, our plastic bag with the cutoff tip, all the way to the base. Squeeze in about a tablespoon into the opening, and then carefully fold those delicate petals over any openings until covered. And you're always going to have a couple extra petals, which you're just going to want to fold back over like that. So really not that hard. All right, those are going to go in the fridge until we're ready. We want those very firm when we dip them in the batter. All right, so those go in the fridge. Speaking of batter, could not be easier. Cornstarch, self-rising flour, and water. And by the way, let this be a lesson to you. Do not be stubborn in the kitchen. That bowl was too small. I realized it as soon as I added the flour. So I switched to a bigger bowl. All right, to the cornstarch and self-rising flour, we're going to add some ice cold water. Now I'll give you measurements on the site, of course, but the water, there's not really a measurement. I just add a little bit at a time until we have a mixture that's basically the same consistency as a pancake batter. All right, you can see it right there. Next, I'm going to put about an inch of vegetable oil in a heavy-duty pan. I'm using cast iron here, and I'm going to get it nice and hot. If you're going by temperature, about 350. You can test it with a little piece of batter. All right, so that's ready. I'm going to take out my squash blossoms. I'm going to dust them lightly with flour on all sides. That's going to help the batter stick. All right, and after they're dusted, I'm going to dip them into my batter. You can again see that consistency. You want it just like that. Let it drip off and quickly, carefully place them in your hot oil. I'm just doing 3 here because I got to film it and work at the same time, but you could probably do 6 in this pan easily. And these are only going to take a couple minutes. So on the first side, I went about a minute. I flipped it, and because of the way the batter flattens out a little bit, you're basically going to get 3 sides, not 2. So I flipped it once. I went another minute. I flipped it onto that third side and went about, I don't know, maybe half a minute. They really do cook quickly. I'm going to remove those to a paper towel to drain. Of course, we're going to let these cool for a few minutes so you don't burn your guests. And are those gorgeous or what? So beautiful. So once those have cooled a little bit, we're going to transfer those to a plate. And then, oh man, it's time to dig in. And it's really almost impossible to describe how amazing these are. All right, I know, fried stuffed flowers, can you believe it? But just amazing. That tangy goat cheese, all right, that little bit of extra sharp cheese we have in there, the egg yolk kind of tightens it up a little bit, but not too much, adds a little richness, and that batter, so simple, so light, crisp, but not oily, just really, really beautiful. So anyway, like I said, I really hope you can find some squash blossoms near you. This is such a treat. And by the way, when people are like, hey, what do we have? And you can say cheese-stuffed reproductive organs, which is, you know, always a great conversation starter. So anyway, I really hope you give this a try. All the ingredients are on foodwishes.com as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Roasted butternut squash soup. That's right, even if you don't have a calendar, you can tell when it's turning fall. The leaves change colors, there's a little chill in the air, and Twitter fills up with pictures and links to butternut squash soup recipes. And it was seeing a couple of those that reminded me I've never posted my version for this quintessential autumn soup. So let's go ahead and get started with prepping what I call the world's most dangerous gourd. And that's because the butternut squash is so big and so hard, it's basically a severe cut waiting to happen. So I'm going to show you what I think is the safest way to split this, which is by cutting off the top here. And then what we'll do is we'll take a large sharp knife and cut directly into the center of the neck, just like this. And please note my other hand is not getting anywhere close to this blade. And is it going to matter that I didn't cut that exactly in half because I was paying more attention to the camera than I was to the squash? No, it won't be a problem at all. And then once we split that through the center like that, what we'll do is we'll tip it up like this and simply cut it straight down to split. And for me, not only is that the easiest way, it's definitely the safest, because at no time should any of your fingers be in the way. So we'll split our squash in half, and then we'll grab a spoon and scrape out the seeds. And of course, yes, we could save those seeds and roast them, but we're probably not going to do that. Hey, we're busy making soup. But if you want to, go for it. You are the lords of your gourds, so feel free. And then once our butternut squash has been split and scooped, we can move on to prepping our roasting pan, where we're not only going to roast our squash, but we will also roast the other vegetables going in the soup. So let's go ahead and drizzle a little olive oil into the bottom of the pan, and then we'll dump in our onions and carrots, and we'll give that a nice big pinch of salt, and give that a little toss in the oil. And I'm also going to toss in about 6 whole peeled garlic cloves. All right, don't slice them, don't smash them too much. Just toss those in whole. And then we'll place our butternut squash in, cut side up. And I'm also going to give that a little sprinkling of salt. And then we're going to roast all of that in a 400-degree oven for about an hour or until our squash is soft enough to scoop. So mine took about an hour, but that's really going to depend on the size of your butternuts. And how you're going to tell is how we usually tell. We'll give it the old poke-a-poke with a knife. And as you can see, those have been previously poked. And then what we'll do is we'll let that stuff cool down a little bit. And while we're waiting, we're going to go ahead and make what is basically the secret ingredient to this recipe, a sage-infused brown butter. So what we'll do is we'll melt about 4 tablespoons of butter over medium heat. And you've probably seen this before. First it melts, then it foams up, and then it starts to slowly but surely take on a little bit of a golden color. And at this point, it's not a bad idea to turn your heat down just a hair so we don't go too far, because what we're trying to do is catch it at that perfect moment when it goes from golden to sort of a light nutty brown, which is what we have right here. And at that point, we're going to quickly do 2 things. We're going to turn off the heat and throw in a handful of sage leaves. And even though the heat's off, there's going to be enough heat in that butter to toast those leaves and infuse that butter with its gorgeous, gorgeous flavor. So we'll stir in our sage leaves, and we'll simply leave that on the back of the stove until it's ready to add to the soup, which is going to be pretty soon, because once your veggies are roasted, this is a very fast soup to put together. So we'll go back over to our squash, which have cooled down a little by now, and what we'll do is we'll scoop out that flesh. And yes, we did get a lot of beautiful caramelization on those onions and carrots, which is not only going to add flavor, but it's also going to help give us a beautiful color. Not only do we want this soup to taste roasted, we want it to look roasted. And then, like I said, we'll scoop out our squash into that pan. And please don't worry if you get a little piece of skin here or there. We're definitely going to strain this soup, so no big deal. So we'll go ahead and we'll scoop out our nice soft squash, at which point we are now officially ready to make the soup. So we'll head over to the stove and transfer everything into a soup kettle. And once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add our brown sage butter. And then for a little touch of extra sweetness, we'll do about a tablespoon or 2 of either honey or maple syrup. And both will work beautifully here. But personally, I go with the maple syrup. And the reason is simple. I like Canadians better than I like bees. And then we'll go ahead and add our chicken broth. And yes, of course you can go with water or vegetable stock if you're one of them that are vegetarians. There's nothing wrong with that. Hey, if everybody ate meat, it would be more expensive. So to me, selfishly, they do serve a valuable purpose. And we'll give that a stir. And we'll turn our heat up to high and bring this up to a simmer. And then what we'll do as soon as our soup starts bubbling is we'll turn our heat down to low and simmer this for about 45 minutes to an hour. And even though everything's cooked, and there really is no great scientific reason to cook it that long, I do it anyway, and I think it comes out better. So I would love to explain why, but I can't. And after about 1 hour, this is what mine looked like. And at this point, we're ready for final production. So the first step to that is we're going to blend this very, very smoothly. And of course, you can do that in batches in a blender, but I find these stick or immersion blenders much, much faster and easier. So I'm going to blend mine for a few minutes until it's very smooth, at which point I'm going to highly suggest we pass this through a strainer. Okay, the blades of a blender or food processor are really never going to break down all that material as small as those incredibly tiny holes in our strainer. So by passing that through, even though it's going to look pretty much the same, you're going to get something that on the palate feels much smoother, much silkier. So we'll go ahead and strain our soup, and we should be left with only the most fibrous bits. And then once our soup is strained, we're on to the adjustment phase. First up, adjusting the thickness. So I'm going to check this out with my ladle, and it is very, very close, but I do want it just a hair thinner. I mean, we do want it thick and hearty, but we don't want pie filling. So if you need to, add a little bit of water. That's just you cooking. And then the second adjustment will be to balance the sweetness with the following ingredients. We're going to put a nice big splash of apple cider vinegar, as well as a couple nice big pinches of salt. And of course, we'll bless this with a little shake of cayenne. And as soon as we stir that in, and the soup heats through, we're done. Of course, we're going to take a spoon and taste it. because you may still need to adjust with a little more salt. So I gave mine a taste, and it was perfect. So I went ahead and ladled that up into a hot bowl, and I'm going to garnish it very simply with a nice spoon of creme fraiche, which you know you can make yourself, right? We have a video for that. And then I'm going to finish off with some chopped chives, and that, my friends, may be the best autumn soup of all time. Just an absolutely gorgeous color, and what I'm pretty sure you'll think is an incredibly deep, rich, satisfying flavor. I mean, butternut squash already have a beautiful, earthy, subtle sweetness that we've just accentuated a little bit with that maple syrup. And the way those sweet flavors kind of play against that little bit of vinegar and that little bit of tanginess from the creme fraiche is just absolutely delicious. But anyway, that's it. Roasted butternut squash soup. I was just about to say wait for the next cold, rainy day and whip up a pot. But you know what? This stuff is so good. No matter what your current atmospheric conditions are, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Spicy lamb sausage and rice stuffed acorn squash. Such a beautiful way to use these gorgeous gourds. And while it takes a while to bake, it is a very, very fast and easy recipe to make. The hardest thing may be cutting these acorn squash in half because they're really, really hard. So you're going to want to make sure you got a nice, sharp knife. You're going to keep your hands and fingers completely away from that blade. I like to start it by sort of rocking it back and forth until it's definitely going down the center. All right, that little stem end there, that's the hardest part, so be careful there. Try to go down the middle as evenly as possible and just keep your fingers out of the way and you should be fine. I might give it a tap or two to help it along. All right, once I have it cut in half, I want to see how it sits. If it's not sitting on a flat spot, I'll take the knife and just give it a little trim just to take off that rounded edge so it sits a little more securely. Next step, of course, we're going to take a spoon or a melon baller and just scrape out all those seeds and fibers. And those are prepped. I'm going to toss those into a casserole dish. I lightly oiled the bottom. And then it's on to our stuffing, which features this. Merguez sausage, a spicy lamb sausage, very, very highly spiced. You can use any spicy sausage for this. I'm going to take it out of the casing. So just cut it with a knife. I'm using scissors here. And that meat will pull right out. All right, so I have about a half pound. I'm going to crumble it up in a bowl. I'm going to add some salt, some freshly ground black pepper, some cumin, some cinnamon. I'm also going to add some finely diced red bell peppers and a lot of fresh mint. All right, so mint and lamb definitely go well together, so that really works here. I'm also going to crack in 1 large egg and, what may be a little bit of a surprise, some yogurt or buttermilk. Either will work. I'm using buttermilk here. All right, just a little bit. All right, I want you to take a spoon and I want you to mix that really, really well. I want you to break that meat down into a paste until it looks like that. At that point, I'm going to add a cup of cooked rice. Now, I know you see a little bit of steam there. Don't be alarmed. Mine was still a little warm, which is okay, but cold or room temperature also works. All right, so I'm going to dump the rice in. We're going to mix that thoroughly. And when it's all combined, we're going to go ahead and fill our 4 acorn squash halves. All right, and you want to pack it down pretty good. And you want to go around to make sure you've divided it evenly, which I have right there. All right, to finish this off, I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle a little bit of breadcrumb over the top. I'm also going to put a light dusting of Parmesan cheese and just maybe a half a teaspoon of olive oil per. Just drizzle it over. So just a little bit of a crust on there sort of protects it, and it will make it look very, very pretty later. All right, now we're going to put this in a 350-degree oven, covered, but very loosely covered. I want you to take a piece of foil and just basically tent it over the top. It should not be touching the squash, all right? I'm going to bake that for 1 hour at 350, and it's going to look like that. So I'm going to test with a skewer here. The acorn squash should just be starting to get tender, just barely starting to soften. I'm going to leave it uncovered, put it back in, same temperature, and bake it for another half hour to 45 minutes until 2 things happen. The top looks beautiful and golden brown, and the squash is very, very soft and tender. Then you are ready to taste something incredibly delicious. And yes, of course, you knew it was coming. Let it cool a little bit so you can actually taste it. You're going to be tempted to dig right in, but trust me, a 15-minute wait will be well rewarded with an awesome bite of food. Look at that. Such a glorious combination, that sweet, earthy squash, the spicy sausage, the comforting rice, those slightly exotic seasonings. Just a beautiful thing. Acorn squash, you know they're good for you, but they're almost too good for you. So let's make them a little less good by adding some spicy sausage, yet still have a healthy and delicious dinner, lunch, side dish, you name it. So I really hope you give it a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts, as usual. And as always, enjoy. Delicata squash. That's right, I'm going to show you how to prep and cook what I think is the world's most exciting winter squash. And I know there's not a lot of competition, but this really is a great product and very much underused. And I think that's because it sort of looks and feels like one of those decorative gourds that your mom would put on the mantle around the holidays. But while it is very attractive, the real beauty lies within, as we're about to reveal. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. In the beginning, we need to do two things. Split this in half lengthwise and not cut off a finger. Okay, because these things are very hard, we have to be very, very careful. So what we want to do first is slice off both ends. Okay, that stem part that was attached to the plant is extremely hard. And if we don't remove that, this is a lot harder to cut. And then we'll spin it around and cut off the end where the flower was attached. And then what we'll do once those ends are trimmed off is sort of roll it around and try to find a spot that's maybe a little flatter than the other spots. And there might not be one, but whatever position you think is the most stable. And then what we'll look for is a seam that's right in the middle. And we'll start to cut in, but just barely. Because once that gets started, we want to take our other hand and use that to kind of pound the knife into the squash. And once there's no knife left to pound, we will switch to a rocking motion. And we'll simply rock it back and forth, applying a little bit of pressure until we finish that cut. And by using this method, there's very little chance you're going to cut yourself. All right, maybe a few of you will still manage. But since there's really no fingers coming close to that blade, this really is a pretty safe method. And then what we'll do once that's been split open is take a spoon and scrape out the seeds and any of those fibrous bits. And if this was another channel, I'd tell you you could save those seeds and roast them and then eat them. But I've never actually done that, so I don't really feel right telling you to. But anyway, we'll go ahead and remove those seeds as shown, at which point we will flip these over to the flat side, and then proceed to slice these into nice evenly sized pieces. Alright, I think 1/4 inch is too small, and 1/2 inch is too big. So I'm going to shoot for about 3/8. But as usual, you're going to decide. You are, after all, the Peter Tosh of your delicata squash. Although when you do pick a size, you want to stick with it. So these all cook at the same rate. And please notice I'm using what I call the sushi cut, which is where we find the mark with the front of our knife and then slice through with a very smooth, elegant forward motion. All right, one smooth slice should do it. Oh, and as you should have noticed by now, we didn't remove the skin. Okay, one of the great features about the delicata squash is that the skin is very, very thin, and once cooked up is not only edible, but extremely pleasurable. So anyway, we'll go ahead and slice those up. And if you have to clean up a few of those end pieces with a spoon, go ahead. And once those are set, we'll use our bench scraper to transfer those into a bowl, where we're going to season those with some olive oil, salt, and cayenne. And you would have seen me do that if my battery hadn't run out. But good news, I didn't actually put enough in. So I changed my battery and added some more. And to recap, that was olive oil, salt, and cayenne pepper to taste. And once that's seasoned up any which way you want, we'll go ahead and give that a toss to make sure that's all evenly coated. And you could just use your hand or a spatula. But of course, if you're cool and people are watching, you'll want to give it a flip or two. And then once our squash are seasoned and well lubricated, we'll transfer those onto a sheet pan. And I'm using one of these textured nonstick ones, but a pan lined with parchment or a silk pad would also work perfectly. And we'll go ahead and spread those out, because of course we just want a single layer, just a single layer, just a single layer, just a single layer. By the way, I've heard Beyonce's a huge fan of the show. Well, not so much heard, but I assume. So we will transfer those to the pan and space them out as evenly as we can, at which point these are ready to roast. So let's go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 12 to 18 minutes, depends on the size, or until the bottoms are browned and they're nice and tender. So I let these go for about 12 minutes, and I pulled them out to take a look, and I gave them a little test with a toothpick. and they were tender, and the bottoms were browned, but I wanted them to go a little farther. All right, these were close, but I wanted a little more caramelization. So I decided to pop mine back in for about 5 minutes. And yes, you can flip them if you want, but I don't. I'm not against it. I love flipping things. Pancakes, houses, scripts. But I actually prefer the texture and appearance if one side is really brown and the other side isn't. But suit yourself. If you want to add a step, go ahead and flip them. But like I said, I went ahead and put those back in for 5 minutes, at which point I determined they were perfectly done. And at this point, they are ready to serve, hot, warm, or room temp, which is how I like them best. So I let these cool down all the way, because while they do make a fantastic side dish served warm, my favorite use for these is served at room temp with a dip as a snack. So I transferred those to a dish with that beautiful brown side up and served it with the world's first pumpkin spice aioli. Actually, it was just curry spice. But since this fall we're going to brand that seasonally and call it a pumpkin spice aioli, mostly to annoy people on Twitter. And that, my friends, is an amazing, seasonal, possibly holiday snack. So let me go ahead and grab one of these and give it a dip, and possibly a double dip. And that really is an incredible treat. Right, that flesh is sweet and starchy and tender and sort of creamy. Plus we have that very thin sort of snappy skin that I wouldn't really call crispy, but I wouldn't call it not crispy. It's just a really interesting combination of textures. And if you're repulsed by the thought of a pumpkin spice aioli, which you probably should be, which as I said was just a curry spice, this would be good with so many other dips. Okay, a lemon aioli would be great, or any kind of yogurt-based sauce. You will figure out something. But anyway, that's it. My favorite use for delicata squash. I always see piles of these at the store this time of year, but I never see anyone buying them. So hopefully this video might help with that, because you'll make a batch and everyone at your party will be like, hey, what is this? And how do you make it? So for those reasons and more, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Zucchini and ricotta casserole. That's right, it might not look like much, but this was so incredibly delicious, and right about this time of year you are welcoming any kind of zucchini recipe that makes you forget you're eating zucchini, and this one does. So check it out. Alright, first step here, we're going to cut up our zucchini, but in a very specific and quite exciting way. So we're going to top and tail them, and then we're going to cut it lengthwise in half, just like that, and then we're going to cut them in chunks. But we're going to use like 45-degree angle cuts like that. Angle it one way, angle it the other, and that way, and back that way. So basically we're cutting them in large triangles. Why? Because people love pointy food. It's a proven fact. So if you have to rewind that a couple times and watch it over, you'll catch what I'm doing and I'll, get a few extra views. It doesn't hurt. All right, once your zucchini's cut, throw it in a mixing bowl. We're going to toss in a good amount of crushed garlic, a nice glug of olive oil, some salt, of course. Bland vegetables are the devil's playground, so you got to salt your vegetables generously. I'm also going to give it a little pinch of smoked paprika, because that's going to taste good in this. And then last, and maybe most importantly, a giant pinch of freshly sliced mint leaves. That's right, I did a chiffonade. We've done that before. Do I need to do that demo again? All right, so I rolled up some fresh mint leaves, sliced them up, threw that in. That herb is amazing with zucchini. All right, wait till you try this. All right, we're going to take a spatula and we're going to mix that thoroughly, and then we're going to transfer it into any kind of baking dish. I'm using this round one, but you can use any kind of casserole dish. And since the amounts in this recipe are not so important, chop all your zucchini and then figure out which baking dish you have fits it. That's even a better system. And then we're going to take a spoon and place dollops of regular ricotta all over the top. And basically what you're looking for as far as a ratio, you want the spaces between the dollops to be as big as the dollops themselves. So we're not going for total coverage. We do want some spaces in between, but we are going to be fairly generous. So I use like a cup, and once the ricotta is down, we're going to go ahead and sprinkle it with cayenne. I think it looks really cool when it bakes. And of course, I have a little bit of a fetish, so I'm going to sprinkle that on, and that is ready for a preheated, very hot oven. That's going to bake in a 450-degree oven for 30 minutes. And why I want it so hot, I want the edges, those pointy edges of zucchini and that ricotta to really caramelize. If you cook this at a low temperature for a long time, the juices would leak out of the zucchini and it would just kind of stew and steam instead of roast. So you see here, the edges are kind of browned, the cheese is kind of caramelized, and yet it's not all soupy. And like I said, it might not be the most attractive zucchini side dish ever, but when you dig that fork in and you taste that soft, tender, sweet zucchini with that baked ricotta cheese, you get that little spicy, smoky hint from the paprika and the cayenne. Underneath you have the garlic and the fresh mint just brightening it up. It's just really a great combination of tastes and textures. And that plain ricotta, when you bake it like this, gets sweeter and kind of dry, and it is a great contrast with that roasted zucchini. And like I said earlier, this time of year, people are generally pretty sick of zucchini, especially if you have a garden. That's right, you planted too much, didn't you? So this really is great if you have SZF, severe zucchini fatigue. It's a common condition, and this will cure it. So I really hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Butternut squash and mascarpone cheese gnocchi. Or is it mascarpone? I don't know, it was Al Capone, not El Capone. Anyway, however you pronounce it, this was so unbelievably delicious, and here's how I did it. It was pretty easy. I took a butternut squash. I'm only going to use about half of it. I want a pound in this recipe. So I trimmed off the top, cut it in half, split that down the middle. Once that was split, I put it on a plate, covered it in plastic wrap, and microwaved it on high until tender. Now I know we don't do a lot of microwaving around here, but it works great for this. You could roast it if you want, but this is just a lot faster and easier. So that's how I did it. You can do it any way you want. So that took me about 8 minutes. I unwrapped it, I let it cool on paper towels, and when it's cool enough to handle, peel off the skin. It should peel right off. If not, use a knife. So there we go. I got about 2 cups all together, and I'm going to set that aside until needed. All right, for the rest of the mixture, so easy. Some mascarpone cheese, very, very rich. Italian cream cheese. We're also going to add a couple large eggs, some salt, some black pepper, and some Parmesan cheese. Okay, finely grated Parmesan. And once that's grated in there, I'm going to give this a mix. And right here I realized, why am I trying to mix this with a spatula? So I switched to a whisk, which is going to do a faster and better job. And you want to whisk that together until it's all smooth. And it looks like that. All right. And then we're going to throw in, which by now is just barely warm, butternut squash. I'm going to whisk that in. I'm going to mash it. I'm not going to puree this in a blender, which some recipes will have you do. I actually want those little tiny particles of squash intact. I think it's a little harder to work with, but I think it's much better for the final product. All right, and then the final ingredient here, which I'm going to stir in a couple additions, is just regular all-purpose flour. Not much. I'm only going to put in about a cup. Unlike most traditional gnocchi recipes, this is not a dense, chewy, kind of firm gnocchi. This is a very soft, light, tender dumpling. So we don't want to do too much mixing here. As soon as the flour disappears, that's it. It'll look like that, which is too soft to work with. So we're going to wrap it in plastic, and we're going to refrigerate this hopefully overnight. At least 4 or 5 hours, but overnight's better, and you'll notice the next day it's pretty much firmed up and will let us form our dumplings. But before we unwrap this and start that process, we need to do 2 things. We're going to bring some salted water to a boil. Now I'm using a shallow saucepan here so you can see what I'm doing. You can use a stock pot if you want, of course. And we're also going to melt some butter in a non-stick pan next to that water. So just use medium heat. As soon as the butter melts, turn off the flame until needed. All right, and now the fun part to shape our gnocchi. We're going to use 2 tablespoons. The first one I'm going to stick in there. I'm going to grab about, I don't know, maybe a teaspoon and a half of mixture. And I'm going to use the second spoon to push it off into the boiling water. So very simple process. First spoon scoops a little. Second spoon pushes it off into the boiling salted water. Now here's some good news. No matter how bad a job you think you're doing at this, it's going to look awesome when it's cooked. Gnocchi hate anxiety. Okay, they don't respond well, so I need you to relax and actually have some fun while you're doing this. All right, so our heat's on high. We're going to do these in batches. I usually do about 12 to 15 at a time. I'm doing a few less here just for the camera. In like a minute or 2, they're going to float to the top,
And once they float to the top, I let them boil another minute. So this whole thing only takes a couple minutes per batch. And after they floated to the top and cooked for another minute, I fish them out with one of these strainers right into my butter. And you can just let them sit there until you're ready for final service. And be sure to read the blog post where I explain what to do if you don't want to cook these right away. But I do. So I'm going to go ahead and crank my heat up to medium high. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to brown these in the butter, maybe 3-4 minutes per side. You have to be the judge. But basically, we want a nice golden brown crust and a light creamy center. All right, while that's happening, I'm going to go ahead and season these with some black pepper, some cayenne, and another pinch of salt. All right, and after 3 or 4 minutes, I decided mine were perfect to turn. All right, so you can use tongs for this. I'm using 2 freakishly small wooden spoons. By the way, yes, I believe this is the first time we've had hot, freakishly small wooden spoon on freakishly small wooden spoon action. So that's kind of cool. All right, so I flip those over carefully, and we're going to give them a few minutes on the other side. And while that's happening, the last ingredient, I'm going to throw in some thinly sliced sage leaves, which just works so amazingly perfect with this dish. So the sage went in. I gave it another 2 minutes or so, and at this point my senses of sight, sound, and smell told me, hey, these are done. Let's eat. I remove those to a warm plate. I'm just doing little appetizer-sized portions. I'm going to spoon a little bit of that browned butter over. All right, you don't need much, like a teaspoon's fine. What is that, maybe 30 or 40 calories? Everyone relax. I'm going to hit it with some Parmesan cheese, and there you go. Just unbelievably delicious. That outside is golden brown, slightly crisp from that Parmesan kind of crusting up. The inside, impossibly light, tender, and delicious. So I hope you give those a try. This would make a fantastic first course for any winter, fall dinner, especially around the holidays. So anyway, head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more information, as usual. And as always, enjoy.
Grilled patty pan squash with chorizo vinaigrette. That's right, thanks to a recent trip to Farmer's Market, I found myself in possession of some really gorgeous summer squash, which I was originally going to stuff with chorizo, but because of the variance in shapes and sizes, I decided to go with this instead. And not only did this come out very, very delicious, but it was extremely simple. In fact, there's actually more words in the title than there are ingredients in the recipe. And when it comes to simple summer dishes like this, that's usually a very good thing. So first up, let's go ahead and prep our patty pan squash. And for that, all we need to do is basically cut these in half, which is pretty easy for the shorter, fatter ones. So being very careful, because squash can be slippery, we will try to find the center, which is going to be on one side or the other of that scalloped edge, and we'll simply cut it in two. And then if you want, and I do, we can do a little trimming to either end, and that's pretty much it. So like I said, very simple for the ones that are shaped like that. But where this does get a little tricky is if you have larger, flatter ones like this. Oh yeah, that's going to be too dangerous to try to cut straight down. There's just not a safe place to grip it. Or I guess we could go this way, but that's not easy either. So here's what I suggest. I like to take a small sharp knife and just cut in about 1 inch deep right into that scalloped edge, and then I'll just rotate it, cutting it all the way around. And again, I'm only going about 1 inch deep, and once we've scored it around the circumference like that, all we have to do is flip it over and safely finish the cut through the middle. And that's it. And like I said, if you want, you can trim off the ends. It's more of an aesthetic thing. But anyway, using one or both of those techniques, we're going to cut our squash in half, at which point we're going to lay some paper towel down on a sheet pan and place down our patty pans cut side up and give them a nice generous sprinkling of salt. And not only is that salt going to help season this incredibly bland vegetable, but it's also going to draw out some water, which we call in the business squash tears, and that's actually going to help concentrate some of the flavor. So like I said, we'll salt our squash and we'll let it sit out for about 15 minutes. And while that's happening, let's go over to the stove and start what we're calling a chorizo vinaigrette. So I'm going to place a heavy skillet down on medium heat, into which I've drizzled a little bit of olive oil, and then I'm going to crumble in about 6 ounces of fresh chorizo. Okay, we're using the raw ground chorizo for this, not the cured Spanish sausage style. Very important. And all we're going to do for about the next 10 minutes is cook this over medium heat until it's very well browned and broken down into as small pieces as we can get. And as you can see, I'm accomplishing that by breaking it up with this wooden spatula. And you really can't get this too small. So we really do want to get in there and break this up really, really fine. And don't be surprised if you get a little bit of caramelization, a little bit of a fond, as we call it, forming on the bottom of the pan. You want that, that's a good thing. But anyway, like I said, we're going to continue to cook that and crumble that until we have something that looks like this, at which point we can turn off our heat and dump in our oil and our vinegar. And by the way, if that sounds a little strange, I have 3 words for you: hot bacon dressing. All right, so this is nothing new. Precedents have been set, and delicious ones at that. So we'll stir in our oil and vinegar, and believe it or not, that's pretty much it. That's the beauty of using chorizo, which is pretty much fully seasoned. We will, however, add one last ingredient, which is going to be some freshly sliced mint, and that's going to add a nice little freshness, a little bit of sweetness in the background. So we will stir in our mint, and our chorizo vinaigrette is done. And then all we're going to do is set that aside until our squash is grilled and ready to be drenched with its goodness. So we'll set that aside and head back over to our squash, which have been sitting out for 15 minutes now. And at this point, they're ready to grill. But what we'll want to do first is take a paper towel and blot off any of that excess moisture from the surface. You know we try not to put wet things down on grills. So we'll blot off all the moisture that salt drew out, at which point we'll head out to the grill to cook these up. And I'm going to be grilling mine over mesquite, which, if you're interested, is my favorite kind of natural lump charcoal. And we'll place those down and grill them for, 3 or 4 minutes per side or until just barely tender. And because I had them, I'm also going to grill up a couple Jimmy Nardello peppers, which I thought would make for a nice garnish. And because we have such a wide variety of sizes and shapes, you're just going to have to keep an eye on everything and pull them off as they finish. All right, we don't want them still raw and crunchy, nor do we want them soft and mushy. So let's shoot for perfection. And what we're looking for is signs that moisture is starting to kind of bubble up to the surface. All right, can you see that? That's a really good sign you're just about there. And if we take the tongs and kind of give it a squeeze, the vegetable's no longer stiff and hard, but there's a little bit of a give to it. And obviously, if you want to give these the old poke with a knife or a fork, you can check that way. And I should mention we really do want to get a nice char on these. Believe it or not, the bitterness in those black grill marks is exactly the thing that brings out the sweetness in vegetables cooked this way. So we'll go ahead and we'll grill up our squash, and then once our squash are grilled to perfection, we will head back inside for final assembly. So let's go ahead and transfer those into some kind of attractive serving platter, and we will top that with our warm chorizo vinaigrette, which, by the way, if you've made ahead, you've reheated with maybe a little splash of water. So we'll go ahead and we'll spoon over that amazingly beautiful, amazingly flavorful chorizo vinaigrette. And of course, we want to make sure every one of those squash gets a nice dousing. And then once that was set, I went ahead and finished up with my grilled peppers, which I will admit are for decoration. Just between you and me, I think I'm going to use those for an omelet tomorrow. Although they would be absolutely delicious in this. And we'll finish off with a little more fresh mint. And for whatever reason, if you're not into mint, Italian parsley would also work very well here. You are the Chris Bosch of your summer squash. And speaking of the heat, this is one of those dishes that's great hot, warm, or room temperature. And actually, I've never had it cold, but it's probably good cold too. And I realize there's not a lot of competition, but that, my friends, was the most delicious summer squash dish maybe I've ever had. And because we totally cheated and used something as flavorful as chorizo, this really only required a couple other ingredients. So if you're one of these people that thinks there's no way you could turn boring, bland patty pans into something extraordinarily delicious, I think from this video you'll realize that myth has been squashed. So I really do hope you give these a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Summer squash and sausage stew. That's right, this is another installment in our long-running series, What the Heck Am I Supposed to Do with All These Summer Squash? And this time we're utilizing a super simple tomatoey, potatoey sausage stew in which to hide the aforementioned squash. And oh man, did it work beautifully. So check this out, this was absolutely delicious. So I have a couple andouille sausage, those are lightly smoked, pork sausage, a little spicy. I have some round green summer squash, some yellow zucchini, and what they call white or silver zucchini. So step one, I'm going to slice up the sausage. So I cut those in half, and I thought I was going to do 4 slices at once. But after a couple cuts, I realized I'm not cutting them that even. So I just went to doing 2 instead, which was much easier. So the moral of the story, don't be a hero, okay? So we're going to slice up our sausage, and then of course we're going to cut up our squash. I'm going to cut the end off. I'm going to cut this in half. Then I'll use a little angled cut at the bottom to remove that. Although I think that's optional. I'm pretty sure that's not poisonous, so up to you. And then we're going to cut each half in half, and then across in 3 sections, just like that. And you know the drill here. Once you've picked a size, you got to stick with it. So try to get as evenly sized pieces as possible. That's only because we want it to cook at the same rate, all right? And even though our zucchini is a different shape than the round squash, we're still going to cut off the ends, cut it in half, all right, cut that down the middle, and use that first green squash we cut as a guide to get similarly sized pieces. So take your time and cut up your squash as uniformly as possible. And then besides our sausage and squash, we're also going to add some potatoes. So I have some Yukon Gold potatoes that I've peeled and quartered. And if you're going low carb, those are optional, but this stew is 10 to 15 times better with the potatoes. And that's not my opinion, that is a fact. So I'm going to prep those and just leave them in water till needed. And at that point, we're going to go over to the stove where I have a stew pot on medium-high heat with a little bit of olive oil. I'm going to throw in my andouille sausage, and we're going to saute those for about 3 or 4 minutes until they begin to caramelize. And don't be surprised if it smells really good at this point. All right, once the edges start to brown, we're going to go ahead and dump in a diced onion. You can probably lower your heat down to medium at this point, and we're just going to sweat those onions with that sausage for about 5 minutes until they soften and turn translucent. They should look something like that. And at that point, we're going to throw in a whole bunch of garlic, and we're only going to cook the garlic for about a minute. We don't want it to brown. We're just going to give it a quick sizzle. And then I like to dump in a little bit of green pepper. Now, you can use green bell pepper, but I'm actually using a jalapeno I had in the fridge. You know I don't mind this spicy, and jalapeno is not even that spicy anyway. But I think you do want a little bit of green pepper. That little bit of bitterness really brings out the sweetness in the squash and the tomato. So I'm going to stir that in. Next up, we're going to add some tomato product. I'm using crushed San Marzano tomatoes, along with some chicken broth and or stock. So we'll stir that in. At this point, you can raise your heat to high because we're going to bring this up to a simmer. And while we're waiting for that to happen, go ahead and dump in your drained potatoes. And of course, our squash. And don't worry if it doesn't look like there's enough liquid. As soon as it starts to cook, those squash are going to release a lot of moisture. So this will be fine. Of course, having said that, with something like this, you're always going to adjust your liquid level, add a little more stock if you need to. So stir that in, and while we're waiting for that to come up to temperature, we're going to go ahead and season it with a good dose of salt. You know my thoughts on under-seasoned vegetables. I'm really not a fan. So we're going to add some salt now. Of course, we're going to taste and adjust later, because we always do. We'll also give it a little shot of cayenne and some freshly ground black pepper. And other than some fresh parsley at the end, that's pretty much it. All right? So stop me if you've heard this one before. But what we're going to do is bring this up to a simmer on high heat and then back the heat down just to maintain a steady simmer. All right, something like that. And all we're going to do is simply simmer this uncovered until our potatoes and squash are tender. And yes, our pieces of potato are larger than the squash, but that's okay. All right, those potatoes are going to take about 30-35 minutes to get tender, and that's about the perfect amount of time for the squash also, because you don't want these firm. All right, we don't want it falling apart. We still want to identify all the pieces, but we want it cooked all the way through because that's going to give us a beautiful, mild, sweet flavor. And also a little bit of the inside of the zucchini will kind of break down and actually thicken our broth. But when you think you're getting close, you're going to test your potatoes. I just use a knife. Give them the old poka. All right? So when your vegetables are to that perfect point, I'm going to go ahead and stir in a handful of fresh Italian parsley. Stir that in. And other than checking for final seasoning, you're done and ready to serve. All right, so give it a taste. Maybe a little more salt, probably. And once you're happy with it, go ahead and spoon that up. I mean, look at that. That is so unbelievably comforting, tasty, and I'm pretty sure fairly healthy. And then for the final touches, a light dusting of freshly grated Parmesan. I really like what that adds to this. Maybe a little more fresh parsley. That's optional. But what isn't optional? A big slice of crusty bread. All right, I got a nice piece of walnut bread here, just absolutely required for dipping into that amazing broth. And yes, dipping the bread into the broth might be my favorite part of this. Although when you get in there with a spoon, you're going to see the entire thing is just fantastic. Like I said, the key is cooking that squash enough. It'll get sweet and tender. The entire stew is infused with that andouille sausage flavor, which gets absorbed into those potatoes. All right, just a really beautiful bowl of food. So now when your neighbor rings your doorbell with that basket of squash, instead of looking annoyed, you will actually smile and be genuinely grateful you're getting them because you could make this. All right? So I really hope you give that a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.